So, Tom, Amandeep, what would you do in this situation? I was on the train from Leicester to Birmingham last week, going to our grain market outlook briefing, stopped at Narborough station just outside Leicester, and I saw someone on the other side of the platform waiting for the train going the other way, who I knew, kind of friend of a friend kind of thing. Evidently, they were trying to avoid my gaze for that awkward, like, do I wave, do I not wave? And then I was kind of awkwardly trying to avoid their gaze, and we got into this kind of awkward who isn't going to look at who, even though we both know we're looking at each other, but we're not looking at each other kind of thing. And I just felt awkward. Should I have just taken the moral high ground and just done a big wave at them?
I think you should have gone full blown.
Like semaphore, like I'm trying to land a plane kind of waving.
Yeah, if you're both nervous, I think it's whoever breaks out of that nerve, and I think you both lost. It sounds like.
And if they didn't know you, they'd just be happy that this weird stranger's waving at them.
Hello, welcome to Agonomics with me, David Udall, a weekly look at the economics of agriculture. This episode is quite a timely edition as we look in more detail at the recent autumn budget, including inheritance tax and changes to delinked payments. There's been a lot of headlines of late, but with the help of my colleagues from AHDB, Amandeep and Tom, we're going to be exploring what it all means, using the example of our model farm. And we'll also be picking up some of the themes of last week's show when it comes to the sustainable farming incentive. Please follow or subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. New shows drop every Wednesday at midday, and please get in touch. Comment on any of AHDB's social channels or email us agonomics@ahdb.org.uk and let us know where you're listening. It's a busy time of year at AHDB at the moment, especially in the economics world. Obviously, we've had a lot of questions coming from the budget, and we're going to try and cover a few of them today. And obviously, we were on tour last week with Agonomics at the Grain Market Outlook briefing, followed up by a webinar that we had as well. So thank you to everyone that attended that. And further to that, on the cereal side, we've released our cereal quality survey results in the past few days, which show the quality of grains being quite variable and definite problems with ergot compared to what we've seen in previous years. And then upcoming pieces of work that we have and what we're going to be talking about on next week's podcast is a look ahead. We're going to be looking into the future in terms of what the 2030 market for beef and lamb will be and what the trends in herd size will be over the coming years. So very much looking forward to that. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the here and now, and we're going to be talking about the agriculture budget and SFI. And as ever, we've got another mystery music act for you to identify in this episode. We'll be dropping in a few song titles as and when we can, and we will reveal all at the end of the show. Right, so let's kick off and get to it. And we're going to talk about the budget first up. So there's three areas of the budget that we're going to cover in the first half of the podcast. We're going to be talking about delinked payments, we're going to be talking about inheritance tax and the total value of the agriculture budget and the impacts of inflation as well. And Amandeep, our senior economist, joins me, and we're going to be talking about this in a bit more detail. So let's cover off direct payments first, Amandeep. I suppose the two significant changes that we've seen in the budget is that there's a 76% reduction to the first £30,000 of any direct payments, and there is no payment above £30,000. And this is sort of effective immediate from the 2025 payments, and something that will impact everyone across the board that is receiving any of these direct payments. And obviously we knew that these were going to be reduced over time, but this speeds up that reduction of those direct payments. And I guess the question is, what's the impact on the everyday farming business because of this?
Yeah, so just to cover off how stark the difference is, when the 2024 delinked payments calculation was in place for last year, the first £30,000 was taxed at 50%. And now this year, like you said, it's 76%. So that's quite a big change in itself. And then above £30,000, there was still a sort of linear progression in terms of how much tax would be applied to different bands, whereas now it's just cut off completely. There's no more up above 30. So that's the first difference. So we've applied all this to our model farms, our spreadsheet farms, so to speak. The idea behind these cuts to direct payments is that it's going to affect those that receive more, the higher proportion of direct payments in the first place compared to those that didn't receive that much. So if we take a look at our arable farm, for example, we've got one here which is about 455 hectares, and originally that was receiving in 2020, before the cuts took place, about £105,000. If we carried on going along to our original reductions as they were before this announcement, it would have been projected to receive around £30,000, just over £30,000 in 2025. But now, because of this new change with the 76% reduction in the first 30 grand, it's only going to get £7,200. If you're a farmer, you're planning on getting that payment and you'd made plans to, you budget that into your forecast for going forwards, that's quite a big drop to suddenly have to take.
Let's just repeat that, just to make sure we've kind of like, I've got it clear in my head. So we're just talking about what would be, in the farm we put together, it's kind of as an average, a generic arable farm as we can pull together to be indicative. As you said, 450 hectares, so that was expecting to be getting around £30,000 of direct payments in 25, but because of these changes, that's now going to be reduced by around £23,000, if not slightly more than £23,000, and they'll only be receiving 7,200. So that's quite a significant volume of cash that's been taken out of that business. And as you say, that's definitely going to be impacting that farmer planning, isn't it? And that budgeting process going forwards. So I suppose putting that into context, that £23,000 looking forwards, it's sort of the November 25 wheat price, that's the equivalent of about 120 tons worth of grain that's been taken out of that business. So if you use an average yield, it's the best part of 15 hectares of reduction that's been taken out, which is pretty significant. Is that indicative across the board, or are there other examples of how this payment change could impact businesses?
So we also have a beef and sheep farm which received around £34,000 in 2020. If we applied the same gradual reductions to that, under the original reductions, it would have received around £12,500. With the new phase out for 2025, it's only getting £7,200, which in percentage terms is lower than for what we see for the arable farm. So it's a 53% reduction year on year compared with, the 81% odd for arable. I suppose it might be less in percentage terms, it might be less in absolute terms, but I think for a business that's factored in to use that money, it's still going to be a significant amount of money. So I know they've said it's going to impact those farms that received more originally more, but it's still going to have quite a important impact on even those who are receiving less, because they've factored that into their plans going forward, and they've still got to find that chunk of money which they plan to have, but they're not going to have because of these changes. It's not only just about looking at what they were planning to use that cash for. It's also, we've got to remember that originally when these schemes were thought of and put in place, we knew that direct payments were going to be reducing gradually, and that these ELM schemes were going to be coming in to not fill the gap, because that's not what they're designed to do, but to at least help alleviate that sort of gap in some respects. But what's going to happen now is that there are some cases where farmers are caught in between schemes. So they might be in the old countryside stewardship, their agreement's about to end, they're sort of approaching the end of the agreement. They can't quite get into a new scheme just because of other mitigating factors. They might not be able to qualify for certain actions. What is their source of income going forwards in terms to mitigate that gap? And that's like a real cause of concern. DEFRA have said that they've indicated there might be extensions to those that are in the older sort of schemes, but we need more clarity on that to see how it all plays out. I
suppose that links nicely into something else that we're going to talk about, of the sort of total agriculture budget as well, because we're talking about essentially direct payments to farms reducing, so farmers' expectations of their income falling. But obviously what we've seen over the last 5 years is there's been that significant increase in inflation. And a previous piece of work that we did a few weeks ago was saying that, that inflationary impact was essentially around 44%. That's eroded the value of the farming budget since 2019. And then if you factor in, because of the budget, the changes to the Office for Budgetary Responsibilities forecasts for inflation, and they're thinking inflation's going to stay a little bit on that kind of slightly bigger than we would like kind of area. That again is a concern for the total agriculture budget. It reduces how far that spend can go, doesn't it, Amandeep?
Yeah, exactly. So like you said, 44% was based on how much farm input costs had increased over the last period of the last Parliament. And going forward, so there's always that kind of erosion of that value of that 2.4 billion already built in there. And going forward now, as you said, so The Office of Budget Responsibility is looking at another increase in inflation, about 2.6% going for the next couple of years. And that's just based on the CPI index. So you've got to bear in mind that for farming budget, in reality, that sort of inflation is going to be a bit higher than what the CPI inflation forecast is. And if we just take it into account their forecast, then I suppose by the sort of in a couple of years' time, you're looking at that 44% really going towards almost 52% in terms of when you inflation adjust it for inflation. So the real value of the ag budget is going to be probably just around £1 billion, not the 2.4 billion that is currently set, because it will be eroded by that inflation going forward.
And I suppose that's, in the first instance with the reduction in delinked payments, we're talking about uncertainty because of the lack of income. But also what we're talking about there is, I suppose, the longer term lack of certainty, I suppose, in the effectiveness in those government support schemes and how far they could stretch. So what we know is from a perspective of confidence in farming sector that has been at a low. The NFU do an annual survey of farmer confidence, and at the start of this year it was the lowest since 2010, and has definitely taken a nosedive over recent years. So there isn't the confidence there. There isn't the stability and the clarity to invest, and as we know from sort of general economic theory, if there isn't confidence, people don't invest, and if you don't invest now, that reduces your potential to make income in the future as well. So from that perspective of delinked payments and the changes to the total budget, it definitely adds a more uncertain picture for farming businesses across the board to operate in. So that's two of the three things with the budgets we're going to talk about. We've looked at delinked payments, we've looked at the total agriculture budget. Let's now talk about inheritance tax. And I'm going to heavily caveat this is not advice. I am not a tax advisor. There are definitely people who are able to provide in-depth views of how individual farm businesses and how individuals will be affected by this. And we would definitely encourage people to go and seek out that advice. And obviously conscious of the anxiety that this can create and the uncertainty that this can create and the impact on mental health and the impact on farmer mental health of a lot of the changes that we've seen, especially when we're talking about an extremely sensitive subject like inheritance tax and succession and family planning. So if this is an area that does create anxiety and is creating worry, obviously we would be encouraging people to seek out resources that can help them. So this is definitely an area that we'll tread carefully through. And what we are not trying to do with this is overly dramatize the situation or sensationalize anything with regards to inheritance tax. We are purely trying to put some of the changes into context, into how it would impact the model farm that we create. So this is what we're trying to do with this. This is not trying to sensationalize anything at all with tax. And Tom is going to join me to talk through this. I suppose to kick off, Tom, I'm going to now go through to try and explain this, some of the caveats that we have with of how we built this, and then I'll allow you to talk through the impact. So as Amandeep was talking about with regards to the delinked payments, we have a set of model farms. We've chosen our sort of medium-sized arable farm in Cambridgeshire to demonstrate this potential impact of the changes on inheritance tax. And this scenario obviously is centred on the hypothetical family farming that we have passing away after April 2026 and the implications that it then has on their business. So our hypothetical farming question is just over 1,100 acres of arable land. We assume that 65% is owned land and that the farm has a farmhouse and it is making a net profit of just over 200k. In terms of the land value, we're averaging land values as about £10,000 an acre, which is sort of the average sold price for prime arable land in that Cambridgeshire area. And we're using a hypothetical house being valued at £330,000, which again is average for that area that we're looking at. For these calculations, just to be really clear, we are only taking into account the land and the farmhouse. We are not taking into account things such as machinery, buildings, or current assets or personal assets, because it gets really complex. And this is the key thing with this tax situation. It is hugely complex. It is almost unique to each farm in terms of the impact, and therefore it would be remiss of us to try and create a one-size-fits-all impact across all farming businesses. So what we're trying to do here, as I said, is just use our model farm and showing the impact on the farm land itself and the value of the house and how that works through in terms of tax. So that's a lot of caveats there, which probably just shows to show how seriously we're taking this. And as I said, we are not trying to sensationalize. This is purely about creating evidence that we have. So, Tom, from that perspective and that sort of overall view of what we're doing, what is the impact upon our model farm of these tax changes?
So those calculations give us a farm value, just looking at the land and the house, of 7.6 million. So when we take the reliefs that are currently on offer post April 2026, that comes as a married couple. Person one has a nil rate band of 325k and a residence nil rate band of 175, plus the agricultural property relief that we've talked about of 1 million. If you have that for each person, that comes to that 3 million figure. So if we take that 3 million figure from our valuation of 7.6, we have a taxable value of 4.6 million, which, as the government have announced, will be taxed at 20%, giving us a total tax bill of £930,000. So the first of two options that we're going to look at today is using the government's repayment scheme for that tax over 10 years at 7.5% interest. So if the farm was to use that to pay off their 930k tax bill, the net profit of that farm would fall from our original just over £200,000 a year down to just under £40,000 a year. Another way of the family, the next generation, paying off that figure would be to sell some land. Now, obviously, there are implications with selling land, one of which being that you have a smaller farm, you're not able to produce as much, and you've still got fixed costs in place. So if we take a smaller production out, we reduce our variable costs down, which has all been done nicely in our virtual farms as they've been set up. The fall in net profit will be 21%. So it'd be falling just under 50k is what the farm would lose. So looking at it completely face value, the farm would need to sell around 100 acres of land to pay that bill, which doesn't just include the face value of the tax, but also the cost in selling land that surrounds that. By no means is this not a significant decision to have to make. And although I say this with very much caution, on paper, this farm, it may look like is the economic decision would be to sell that land. However, there are lots of implications that may come surrounding that. Obviously, the incentive for the next generation to come and want to farm, whether that is still there when there's a smaller acreage available, and the implications that may have on, for example, the labour force. And you've got a certain number of workers, and if there's less land, it's harder to keep them busy and have a farm that operates to the full extent it can.
And you make a really good point there, I think, Tom, around unintended consequences and externalities. And this is something that, I guess I'm kind of like hesitant about this area because it is so complex and it is so new, as it were, because of all the changes that we've seen, that there is a lot that we have to review in this in terms of any of those unintended consequences, any of those externalities that just haven't been viewed yet. So everything that we've spoken there from a tax perspective, again, is not advice, is not giving a sort of a blanket strategy in terms of this will affect everyone in the same way. What we're trying to do, I suppose, is just put a bit of context around the potential impact that it may create. So, Tom, thank you for that explanation. And I think overall, in terms of everything that we've seen from the budget and the discussion that we've had so far as part of this, the overriding concern, I think, is around that lack of stability and that lack of ability to plan further forwards for agricultural businesses. And as we know, people will be making those decisions, and it comes back to basic economic theory of opportunity cost. You've got two decisions to make. You've got to weigh up which is the better one for you and the impact of it. And it might lead to decisions such as people deciding not to invest in new types of technology, new types of machinery, new varieties of crop, genetics in animals or whatever it would be, if it prevents that lack of investment, that's something that's a risk for productivity growth domestically, or even supporting productivity from not declining domestically, and therefore it's an issue for the efficiency of the sector and therefore for food production. So overall, it just puts that farming sector on a more unstable footing, and it will be, further pieces of work from us as we go forwards. We'll take our time to do them carefully and to then understand that full impact. But thank you to both Tom and Amandeep for taking us through that budget review. We're going to get a break now, and we're going to get the latest on what's happening in the markets. And when we come back, Amandeep is going to come back and join me again, and we're going to talk a bit more about the sustainable farming incentive and a bit more detail on what we were discussing in the grain market outlook briefings and webinar last week.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 6th of January. Despite some support in wheat markets over the Christmas period, prices have been under pressure in the new year from a strengthening US dollar, technical selling and sluggish global demand. However, Russian wheat crop conditions remain in focus, with warmer than usual temperatures and excess moisture in key growing regions. Persistent hot and dry weather in Argentina is also raising concern over the country's maize crop, which is now in its critical development stage. For rapeseed, new crop prices are supported, with doubts over prospects for global rapeseed production in 2025, though forecasts of heavy soybean supplies from South America limit any major price increases. Over the next few weeks, weather in major exporting countries such as South America and Russia will be key in driving prices. The USDA will also release updated global supply and demand estimates at the end of this week. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episodes you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
So we're back for part 2 of Agonomics, and this week in our second section we're going to be looking a bit more at the sustainable farming incentive and reviewing in a bit more detail some of the information that's been covered in our recent grain market outlook briefings and webinars. And Amandeep joins me again to discuss this. And I guess the question we've got, Amandeep, really that big question that we've been working on to try to create an answer for, is that overarching one of, well, how much land is likely to come out of food production because of SFI?
I'm going to cut straight to the chase now and say not a lot. It doesn't make sense for you to reduce your crop area to do these SFI actions, because you're going to get far more money or far more income from growing those crops than you are from doing any of the SFI actions. It's really not in your best interest to take productive land out for these SFI actions. As the whole scheme's been designed, it's designed to go hand in hand with your farming. So there's simple things you can do, like look at your nutrient management plans, integrated pest management plans, your soil assessments. These kind of things you can do alongside your normal farming. You might be able to get a cover crop, within your rotation, companion cropping. It will get you some income. For our farm, we estimate you can get up to at least about £26,000 in extra income for these easy options. And then if you want to take that more ambitious approach, put in the winter bird food, put in some pollen nectar flower mixes, then that's going to require land, but you won't do it on your best land. You do it on your sort of peripheral land, your marginal land, or the areas that aren't really giving you much return on your farm at the moment. And that's the whole point and design of this scheme, is because it's to sort of regenerate that land. So in the future, you might get some more return from it. So you might improve your soil there, for example, and might impact yields in the future. And that's the kind of land you want to use And if we look at sort of the overall UK makeup at the moment in terms of, a croppable area, etc., there's a component there called the uncropped arable land, and that's where most of these agri-environment schemes are taking place at the moment anyway. So countryside stewardship, for example, environmental stewardship, this type of land that these schemes have been carried out in the past. And we'd expect, as you switch out of those and go into these new schemes, that's the kind of land that's going to be used for SFI going forward. In the past decade or so, that kind of amount of uncropped arable land has sort of averaged around 5 to 6% of your total croppable area. And then you might get the odd 1 or 2% as well in terms of if you have got a problematic crop, which some people do, like they might have problems with rapeseed, you've got that persistent cabbage stem flea beetle eating up every year on year. So you might be tempted to go into SFI. And some people have done that and might grow a legume fallow instead, for example.
One question that we got from the grain market outlook briefing, or an area that the industry found interesting, and it's something that's very specific to cereals and something that's been a challenge in recent years, has been around oilseed rape. And we've seen that area of oilseed rape reduce. That's obviously been from a weather impact from the poor planting conditions in 2023, but obviously because of the loss of neonics and the flourishing cabbage stem flea beetle. But actually, our analysis shows that switching away from those, what are sort of deemed as more problematic crops, such as rapeseed, could be a bit more risky than people have probably put first thought to.
Yeah, so we looked at a scenario where we assumed you might have a problem with rapeseed in year one, for example. It's a 3-year agreement. So maybe in year one, you've got a rubbish yield. So we kind of estimated about 1.7 tonnes per hectare. You got that yield. The price is kind of okay, 350 tonnes per hectare. And then what we did was we kind of assumed, would you have been better off growing the rapeseed, or would you have been better off growing an SFI legume fallow? And in the year one, under those conditions for the rapeseed, you would have been better off growing the legume fallow because you would have made an extra £1,500. That's just for year one. What you got to remember is that for SFI, it's a 3-year agreement, so you don't know what's going to happen in year 2 and year 3. You're going to be locked in with that SFI legume for the next couple of years, and in that time, the conditions for rapeseed might become more favourable. So for year 2, for example, we just assumed that maybe you have a better sort of like more average yield, and you get maybe there's a high market price for that, and then in that case, you'd be losing out from having an SFI legume fallow in there because you'd be better off having a rapeseed crop in there instead. And generally speaking, in this scenario, we looked at, so you could maybe potentially make a saving of around £1,500 in your first year, but you've got the potential, depending on market conditions, market prices, the weather, etc., you could lose up to £55,000 having a legume fallow in place rather than rapeseed. So it's depending on your sort of risk profile. Are you willing to gamble on that, considering you don't really know what price is going to do, or you don't really know what the weather's going to do? The legume fallow gives you insurance, like you at least get some income, but then you're losing out from making more money by going down that approach.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's probably more risky and requires more thought process for certain, doesn't it? I suppose the question as well, to finish up, Amandeep, is looking forwards, what's that bigger challenge of all of this in that context of SFI and everything? What's that bigger challenge going forwards?
It's a lot of demands, but a finite resource. So that's land, as we can see here. We got lots of, this. It talks about house building targets. We need it for the environment. We need to produce food, and then we talked about the budget already. So there's a limited pot for all these different things that we've got to do with it. And it's kind of saying, how can we target that money? How can we target the land in a really effective way so we can get all these solutions? And it's not going to be easy, but it's going to require a multifunctional approach, I think, across different departments, across the government, for example, in different areas. And how can you all come together and make the best use of that limited resource and really plan going forward where's the best places to do the different kind of requirements for the environment, for the economy, and for growing food, etc. There's going to be a better plan than what we've got at the moment.
Definitely. It's something that requires that bigger picture thinking, and all of this in terms of everything we've spoken about today is definitely that bigger macro world of agricultural economics. We're looking at those bigger, longer term changes, and these are things that, like from an SFI perspective, you can't just look at that in terms of a year and say whether it's been successful or not, especially understanding some of the, again, either positive or negative unintended consequences of it. We have to look over a longer time period. So this is going to take multiple years to play out to see the full impact and how it's actually driven agricultural production domestically. So really interesting to see where we go. So thank you to Tom and Amandeep for all their input into this week's agonomics. As I said earlier, next week when we're back, we're going to be looking at the work we're doing, looking at 2030 in the world of beef and lamb. So what will the market look like then? So looking forwards, trying to plan ahead for the future. And I will admit, this may be the first time that we have failed. I'm going to apologise to our listeners here. We have failed. We did not manage to get any song titles from our artist in this week. If you thought there were song titles in there and you thought you got an artist, I'd be interested to find out who you thought it was, but it definitely wasn't the one that we put in. So we're going to roll them on to next week and we'll try again and we'll just try harder for you. I think it's just because it was really interesting economic stuff. We geeked out a little bit and just kind of forgot the other bits we were trying to do. So apologies for that. Come back next week. We'll talk about beef and lamb and we'll try harder for you.